Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg and recently also in Europe. But today's episode is proudly powered by Research Luxembourg, which means we are sticking to Luxembourg. Who is our guest? Well, it is Dr. Carlos Vega, research engineer in digital health at the Luxembourg Institute of Health. Some of you know LIH, of course, and teacher of applied philosophy of science and data ethics at the University of Luxembourg. I invited Carlos today because he recently wrote an article which got him a third place in the science.lu science writing competition. Carlos, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much for having me here.
As usual, I send the outline of the questions, and then exactly when I look into the eye of the guest, I get my first question, which is not on the list, but I just wanted to ask, how did you end up with the omelette analogy for the article? Because in the article you write about AI and omelette. Why omelette? Do you like eating eggs?
Well, yes, I'm Spanish, and Spanish omelette is very typical, very traditional. And I was thinking about the article while I was cooking dinner, and that way it came to me.
Listeners, if you haven't read it yet, please do, because it has really nice analogies. So not all of my guests here in the studio, when I talk to them, have good comparisons. So I'm counting on you today that you will have a few for us so we can really see the application of what we're talking about, because in the article you have a few for sure.
Yeah, I will do my best too.
Okay, no pressure, as usual. Okay, I mentioned that you teach applied philosophy of science and data ethics. And to be honest, the moment I see philosophy and ethics together, I think like, this is going to be difficult for me to understand. So first of all, just tell us, what is the course about?
My students also feel a bit overwhelmed at first, but the context of this course is on the Master of Data Science at the University of Luxembourg. So it's not fully in deep philosophy or ethics that we discuss, but rather the topics of philosophy and how they affect the practice of data science. So basically how we action those concepts and lessons from philosophy and ethics into the normal work of a data scientist that they will become in just 2 years.
Do you think it's possible to make youngsters interested in philosophy? I recently had a discussion with physicist, and he was telling me that a lot of things he was explaining to me in philosophy, and I was looking at him as like, I'm kind of getting there with my interest right now, but I do believe that philosophy is something we get more into with age, except for the people who obviously study philosophy, right? So do you see the sparkle in their eyes after a while?
Yes, I have students from many different countries, and in some countries we learn philosophy in high school. This is how I got interested in philosophy myself. My mother studied philosophy, and then afterwards she studied computer science. In my case, I did it the other way around. I studied computer science, and now I'm teaching things about philosophy. And some students already know some stuff, but when you learn it in school, you don't learn the consequences of many things, like from mathematics, from philosophy. And I see they become interesting because the course is illustrated with examples that affect data science. And then they learn new stuff, and usually I'm very happy for the feedback that I get after the course.
So hopefully I will also learn new stuff today. And as usual, I think a few times I already asked this question, but I always love the answer, what is data? Let's start with that, because data is a, let's say, foundation of data science and so many different subjects that are important right now in science.
Indeed, data is the main ingredient of data science. And I usually put the allegory of Plato's cave, in which some slaves are tied and the only reality they know is the shadows that are projected in a wall. And then there are some people behind who are projecting these shadows. And I tell them to imagine that data is just these shadows, that data is just shadows of reality. And this is important because it means that data is itself inaccurate in nature. And the moment you try to collect data, it comes with a degree of error that you need to be aware of, or at least get some methods to measure this error. So data, what is it? Is basically information that you collect from the world through a process, and in doing so, you take some assumptions that may produce some errors as well. This is a very typical mistake that we all undergo as scientists.
But then data science is all about cleaning your data, preparing it, and then doing the analysis. So naturally, everybody is doing that. Everybody knows that there are errors in data.
Exactly. But sometimes you don't know the errors until it's too late. And this creates like a technical debt. The concept is called data cascades. And it's the same as in drug development that some people might be familiar with. You start with a hypothesis, then you do some study with animals, then you continue with humans and so on and so forth. And maybe you find a problem when you are already in the second year of your development, and you need to reconsider your assumptions. You need to reconsider how are you collecting data, how are you processing data, cleaning it, and so on and so forth. And you can make a mistake in every step, from the acquisition of data to the visualization of data in the final steps.
That's what makes me actually stressed when I collect data, because obviously the traditional way you take a table in Excel, you have a few entries, you can see it yourself, you know where it is. But then if you have actually proper data set, it's going to be big. You can't look through it. You are not even supposed to look through it, to be honest. And it's all about the programming that you do, that you actually get the right results. That's the moment when I'm a bit uncomfortable, I have to say.
Yes, I'm happy that you put Excel as an example, because even the decision of using Excel or other tool needs to be properly justified. Excel has a limit on the number of rows that you can use, and this can create problems if your data is bigger than what Excel supports. And it can create problems, especially with contact tracing. We have seen it in United Kingdom, that some people were lost because the Excel reached its limit, and therefore they couldn't contact some people, and they made a calculation of how many lives could have been saved without this issue.
So I haven't heard of that case, actually. So they were collecting people's data in an Excel sheet.
Yeah, for the contact tracing, if we remember from the pandemic, whenever you had COVID, you used to provide the administration with a list of people that you were in contact with, and then they will reach these people to tell them to get into quarantine. The problem is that they were using a very old version of Excel, and this has a limit of 65,000 rows. So even the most trivial decision can have consequences when you are doing data science. This is the main lesson that I usually teach to my students. And then we go through the whole pipeline and see issues at each step, and also relate them to philosophical concepts from where these issues stem, even before the creation or the advent of the computers.
So first of all, listeners need to know that I am a little bit into data science. At a certain moment, I was even considering that path. So I did study a few things, but I assume that not everybody did. So what are the usual steps of data science? Because we mentioned a little bit, but let's just put it from A to Z so it's clear.
Yes, well, we can see different steps. The main one is to collect data, but to do so, we need to come up with a question that we want to answer. So prior to that, we need to come up with a problem, some assumptions about that problem, and then we collect data. We get participants for a survey, or we take an instrument and measure some sounds of the birds, whatever. But the first step is to collect data. The second step is to transform it, to process it, to clean it, as you said. And finally, we synthesize this information, which is just meaning that we make some tables or visualizations from which other people will take actions in the end. So that is the pipeline in a simple, straightforward way. But then every step has many sub-steps that, of course, are its own complexity.
Let's start with the first step, so the data collection. I see a lot of issues there, let's say, with where the data comes from, right? Because, of course, ideally, it's us who collect the data. So we know what we've done, we know what we collected. But sometimes it does happen that it's just like data downloaded freely from the internet, right?
So it is true that nowadays it's very easy to find data in the internet more than ever, because it's very easy to publish it. And at the same time, it's very easy to work with data because we have very powerful tools that are nowadays easier than ever to do some data analysis or create an artificial intelligence tool. But the problem is that this data, you need to know where does it come from. Do you have the consent to use it? Again, this is an ethical question. And again, methodological questions like what and how was this data collected? What sample does it correspond? Is it from European people, from people from North America? What are the characteristics of the subjects that the data is representing? And this we need to take into account, because if we forget about it, we might get into some errors that, again, as in the sample of data cascades, we might find out too late and have a cost in the end.
If you listeners, you're interested a little bit in parallel discussion on that, recently we had Dr. German Castignani from LIST talking about digital twins and exactly this problem of, a lot of data being collected on different cities. But then if you actually want to analyze how those smart cities work, it's not going to be this easy exactly because of the data labeling, of the methodology used. Just even you can imagine that, I don't know, the cell in Excel A is labeled something and it's labeled something completely different in another data set, and you can't really easily compare, right?
Exactly. It's the generative process that needs to be the same. The labels, the criteria to label the information needs to be the same. The sample might have different composition in terms of gender, of age, and so on. This is important to consider.
And I think it's extremely difficult to discuss it because I have a feeling that the moment you start talking about labeling data and cleaning data, many listeners kind of fall asleep and then wake up when you start talking about data viz. I think that's the moment when more people really understand what you've done, right?
Yeah, data visualization is a more attractive part of data science because it involves actually something that you can view very easily, but it comes with problems as well because visualizations can be misleading. We recently have a little hurricane coming to Europe, and there were some graphics that represented the center of the storm in the ocean until it reached the continent. And the problem with this visualization is that it only represents the center of the storm. So people get misled thinking that the storm won't be outside the cone of this visualization, but the storm will be there. And then some people refuse to evacuate these areas, thinking that the storm won't reach these areas. So some visualization can mislead, and in doing so, you can have some consequences, hopefully not people dying.
That's a bit of extreme situation, but of course it's very important to mention. Do you think the solution to this is better data visualization or it's better data literacy?
I think it's a matter of both. First, we need to educate the public to understand some charts, especially the ones that they see more often. But also, a data scientist usually does everything, and this involves many steps, right? From acquisition of the data, processing, and visualization. And indeed, maybe we need more visualization experts, people who dedicate themselves to one specific step. And in some contexts, in some companies where they have the resources to do so, we have people dedicated only to visualizations, like in some journals or some companies, people fully dedicated to make the chart as less misleading as possible, because then actions are taken from that data visualization. And it's important that it's clear and represents exactly the information as it is.
And if you're more interested in data visualization, there was also an interview, this time actually with Aida Joraniet-Ibáñez, so also your compatriot. And what is really interesting about her work is that she actually works with historians. So her task is to visualize data that is collected by historians. And, this is really bridging the gaps and kind of understanding what data is important for humanities, because we tend to actually kind of not always discuss them, let's say, like that when it comes to visualization. Very, very interesting discussion. So do check this out as well. But we jumped. We started with actually collecting the data. Then we said data visualization, but in the middle there is processing as well. And you said that each of those steps has its own problems. So what's the problem with the processing? You just have an easy code, everything works, and it's fine. It's processed.
So, of course, we have in the middle, the processing step that also involves cleaning and so on and so forth. Usually we collect a lot of information and we need to somehow explore it. This is why it's called exploratory data analysis at the beginning. And from there, we select the features that are more interesting. And there we might do the wrong choice as well. Or we might find out that we didn't get the information that we needed and we need to come back to step one. And that has a price, especially if you need to recontact people. So this step involves as well feature engineering, which might be creating new features from the data that you have collected. That can be age, gender, ethnicity, language, demographics in general, for instance. And from that data, you need to come up with something that is relevant for the analysis that you are doing. So you need to keep in mind all the time what questions you want to answer, because otherwise you might get lost. And what can be wrong? Of course, the methods that you employ, you need to do some requirement analysis and check, well, if you have a lot of data, you need to come up with a method that is fast enough to process it. If you are working with image data, you need to come up with special techniques of imaging. If it's medical imaging, then you need special tools and so on and so forth. So it's not especially difficult if you know what you are doing, but you can make a lot of mistakes in every step.
Sounds very serious. I always thought that data scientists, are just those little specialists, that they don't need to have a lot of knowledge. They just need to be able to analyze data more or less, put it, write some Python code or whatever R, and then just get it out, analyze, nice viz, explain to people that's it. But I guess what you're saying is exactly the opposite.
Yeah, that's why it's more important to me knowledge than the methods themselves, because the methods, we have many of them and they are, as I said, readily available. We have more methods than ever and they are very easy to use, but knowledge is difficult to find. And when you are working with data that refers to a specific domain, you need to come up with some experts on the field to help you navigate this data, because the data scientists might be very good at using the methods, but sometimes you need a medical doctor to give you an interpretation, to turn data into information and then knowledge so that you can navigate, as I said, this data. And this is why there are so many interdisciplinary centers where you can find data scientists, mathematicians, statisticians, and then biologists, physicists, and so on and so forth, that will help you get domain knowledge. Because without domain knowledge, data is not enough. You need to give it an interpretation and somehow turn it into information to work with it.
And we keep making mistakes in that field, right? I'm just now referring to the articles you wrote about COVID analysis and the monkeypox analysis, right? So in general, the idea was you collect pictures from the internet and you actually are able to predict whether people have the diseases, right? But it's not this easy.
It's not this easy. The problem is that during the pandemic, a lot of researchers rushed to develop solutions to help in the COVID diagnosis. Some of them worked with chest X-ray images. And basically, there was a researcher who created a public repository for other people to upload data, chest X-ray images. And the problem is that these images come from very different sources and they are done in very different ways with different machines and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of diversity, especially where you don't want diversity. We have different machines, images of different kinds producing these chest X-ray images. Then the methods that they were employing for classifying between healthy and diseased were not the most appropriate. So here it lacked a bit of domain knowledge about the disease, because it's not like you have only people with COVID and then healthy. You don't have perfectly normal lungs and then bad-looking lungs. You might be a smoker and not have COVID. You might be a smoker and have COVID. And the lungs of a person with smoking history look very different from someone who haven't. So you need more diverse set of images to somehow account for all these scenarios, because you can have multiple diseases at the same time. And these researchers, these solutions, did not consider those cases. They just rushed to develop something with the data they had without questioning whether this data was enough or not.
But it all started with actually just publishing the results on the internet. It was not in a peer-reviewed journal. I don't want to comment on peer-reviewed, what's the process, is it good or bad? Just saying that it was really not something, a vetted process, if you want.
Yes, the repository was, of course, public. Every doctor in the world could add his own pictures. This also raises questions about consent of data subjects. But then other researchers could take this data and do their job, develop their solutions, and then they will publish these solutions, sometimes in peer-reviewed journals, sometimes not. And then it's up to the reviewers and the editors to see if it's worth or not. But many publications, peer-reviewed publications, publish this kind of works.
And it was the same with the monkeypox?
For the monkeypox situation, it was fortunately less popular, but we had a little outbreak of monkeypox some months ago or years ago. And there the problem was that some researchers who happened to be students created a synthetic data set of images of different skin diseases like chickenpox, monkeypox, and so on and so forth. The images were coming from Google. They just Googled the disease and downloaded the images in a more automatic way. It's called web scraping, but these images were not validated by medical doctors. So these images have no relevance. And still, they publish a dataset and they call it the first publicly available dataset on monkeypox. Okay, then it's up to others to use it or not. But it happened that some researchers used it. And they published articles in peer-reviewed journals using this dataset that was employing medically irrelevant data. So the problem here is that what happens next? Then hopefully we won't use these solutions in real world because there are a lot of regulations, especially in the medical sector, but it's somehow polluting the scientific literature,
Very important, and it kind of leads me to data ethics in general as well, because to be honest, I would ask the first question, what about copyright? Who owned actually those pictures, right? And before we discuss it, I think it's a good moment to go into the pub quiz question, because I know you told me behind the scenes that this is a question that you sometimes ask to your students when you see that they are falling asleep a little bit when you talk about data ethics. So if you are by any chance, obviously not, but if you are a bit like feeling like grabbing a cup of coffee, stop here, get a coffee, and then you'll be definitely awoken because we have a pub quiz question for you. And as usual, the answer only at the end of the podcast.
Indeed, there are moments in class that the students disconnect and I have to find new provocative ways to get their attention. And for data ethics, one of the questions that I ask them is, how do the protests of women fighting for the right to wear trousers or the miniskirt in the 60s relate to the cookies banners that we find nowadays in every web page?
Great question. And listeners, remember, answer only at the end of the podcast. So we are smoothly moving to data ethics right now. As I said, well, smoothly, not smoothly. This is very, very difficult. And we will definitely discuss it a bit more at the end with the questions. But I already wanted to just touch upon a little bit, right? So I thought that nobody's going to get my data this easily. We have GDPR, we have all these things. Why are we even discussing that someone just downloaded some pictures from the internet and used this data?
Well, first, because the regulation is not worldwide. So we have data sets from China, from the United States, from many countries, okay? Second, because sometimes we consent to things that we don't fully read, right? So it's important to read and understand. This is part of the informed consent. It has to be informed, it has to be voluntary and without coercion. That's why sometimes you don't get paid to participate in a student so that it doesn't bias the participation, right? There's one important example that I always put in class, which is DNA. Because sometimes we want to know something about our DNA, our heritage or diseases, and there are new companies that offer you the service of analyzing your DNA. You need to give them consent, of course, but we need to stop and consider that if I have a brother and basically I'm giving my DNA to this company, if I have a genetically inherited disease, chances are that my brother also has it and my father. So somehow I'm also consenting to give their information when I'm doing this. And finally, what is happening in the United States is that this information can be used by third parties. And some of the participants agree to do so without actually reading the conditions. And then it's important to know that when a company is bought by another company, the data is transferred to this new company. Basically, that's the attractiveness of some companies. When Facebook buys WhatsApp, the interesting part is the user base that they have. So it's very important now with the GDPR, you need to state the purpose of your data and how it will be collected, to how long it will be stored, and so on and so forth. This regulation is very important, but it's not worldwide applied.
Talking of data sharing, I always wondered, I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this question, but when I'm signing up for a new service, nowadays it's so fast and comfortable to sign up with Google or sign up with Facebook. Does it mean that I'm actually giving consent to all the data? I'm linking basically this new service with my Facebook account or not?
Not necessarily. You usually see what is being used, like your email maybe for receiving communications, your name for the username. So usually you should be offered what kind of information is being linked from your Google or Facebook account to this new service.
Usually they should, because I don't remember this happening, but maybe I was just exactly, this is the same with the cookies. I love the fact that in Europe we can actually choose. But at the same time, of course, all these providers know how to put the banners so that in the end, we just don't want to click through them anymore, right? And it's, of course, the regulation says that it should be easy to opt out, but the easy part, you can define it differently, right?
Exactly. And some web pages, what they are doing, especially in online newspapers, what they are doing is that they are offering you either you accept and don't pay any subscription, or you pay, they don't store analytics from you. And now it's been discussed whether this is appropriate or legal or not, because it's somehow coercing the visitor to choose one option over the other. And they should have the option to disagree with the collection of these analytics.
As you wrote an article about AI as well, and some of the article for science.lu, but also some of the things, naturally, if you're a data scientist, IT specialist, AI is the thing that is discussed. What about generative AI and the consent, on the lack of consent on the data that they get to train their models? Is this a gray area? What's happening?
I believe right now it's a gray area, but I always find it funny that you cannot download an image or a video that is copyright, but these companies are scrapping a lot of content that is copyright and using it to build something that has a commercial purpose. So they would afterwards get money from what they built using this data that is copyright. I believe this will change in a few years. We will see that they will forbid this kind of use. But right now, since it's a gray area, they are benefiting from it and trying to collect as much information as possible.
And it's also annoying because naturally, I would say people who are using these services, they will choose services that have more data collected because they will be more powerful. They will generate better images, right? Without giving any names, there is one service right now that prides itself with using their own database of pictures because they have stock imaging in there, which I like a lot, to be honest. But at the same time, if you compare, I'm not sure whether it is as powerful as those ones that are just scrapping the web to get all the results and train their models.
Of course, one important part of building a model is to have diversity in your data. If you don't care about copyright and you collect all information, you will surely have more diversity. But then it's funny that you ask these generative AIs to generate something that you know is copyrighted, let's say the pictures of a particular photographer, and it will generate the same picture. So did this photographer consent for this purpose, for this use of this data? I doubt so.
Going back, because we jumped a lot to the ethics part, I think we will still talk about control and the answer to the question. We can go there too, but I wanted to kind of reverse a little bit. Also in your article in science.lu, but also in other places I found you talk about induction. That is important in science, important method, but maybe not good. Tell us a little bit what induction is.
We use it all the time. Induction reasoning is what we use when we expect the sun to rise in the east again the next day. We use it when we take our phones and we don't expect it to blow up for no reason because the 1,000 times we took it first, it didn't. So induction is a useful tool that everyone uses. The question is whether it's useful for science or not. And here philosophers disagree and agree with this. David Hume came up with the problem of induction 200 years ago, and it has consequences in AI today. Why? Because he says that the reason we expect the future to resemble the past is only because it has worked before. The reason we take one egg from the fig and it works, and then we take yet another egg and it's fine. But the reason we expect the third egg not to be rotten is because our inductive reasoning, because we expect some uniformity of nature. And we cannot prove this uniformity of nature. And if we think about it, nature changes. These new diseases appear. We were commenting on COVID. And it's important to take this into consideration when we are working with data, because we take a limited sample of data that represents the world or a particular region, and we shouldn't necessarily expect that the world won't change. And if you collect new data, will resemble the previous data that you have. And this has consequences when you are building models or analyzing data, because data science is not just AI. One example of this is, for instance, if you are building a model to calculate how long a person with diabetes will live after diagnosis, and you are doing so, for instance, in the United States, and you get some number, let's say 15 years of survivorship, and then you try to transpose those conclusions to Europe, and you realize that they don't work, that they don't apply anymore. Why so? It might be that the population is different. It might be that you collected the data in a different way, or maybe it hasn't anything to do with that, because the disease is the same, the population, let's assume that it's the same, but then there is one important difference that was just waiting there for you without you to notice. That is, the policies in healthcare are different. And in the European Union, most countries cover the expenses of insulin, and that helps survivorship to be higher, while in the United States it's not covered, and then it depends on your economical abilities to buy it. So again, this data cannot be extrapolated to a different region, neither in time to a different point, because things can change. So induction tells us that we should expect things to resemble the past, but there are some risks, because that is not necessarily true all the time, and things do change. We see it all the time.
But it basically means there's no point in trying to figure out, to predict and do science, because, well, science is all about collecting data and trying to figure out what this data tells us about the world, right?
So it is true, we need to reconcile with science in a way, and induction has some risks, but the scientific work is mainly taking this into consideration by properly sizing the number of participants and dimensionating the studies and so on and so forth. Because in the end, the world changes, but that only means that you need to take it into account. For instance, in machine learning, there's one thing that is called machine learning operations. And basically, it means that you are constantly checking that the distribution of your data hasn't changed. It follows the same patterns that you've seen in the past. And if they change, you need to act. And we do this all the time. Epidemiologists are constantly checking how diseases spread, the number of cases, and so on and so forth. But it also affects fashion. In Zalando, they need to take into account if people are buying the same kind of clothes, and if this changes, the distribution moves, they need to adapt their algorithms to recommend new type of clothes, and they need to somehow adapt. So things do change, but that is not necessarily bad. It's just something that you need to bear in mind, because otherwise you can incur into severe errors.
And it reminds me, of, again, my very basic studies of machine learning and data science, and the whole idea of building a model where exactly you have a data set, you split it depending on the situation, you create the model on the basis of that data set, and then you train it, and then you actually take the remaining data set to check if the model is good or bad, right? But that exactly assumes that nothing's going to change, because it's still that data that you collected.
Exactly. That's one issue. It's of course good practice to keep some data apart for later testing, but the problem is that this data comes from the same generative process and the training data. So if there is any issue in the training data, you will probably have it in the test data. So finally, what they should do is external validation. If you are working with data from one hospital in particular, then you need to, once you have your solution, collect data from other hospitals and test it there. Do some external validation is very important. And that's why in science, we publish our results so that others can reproduce them and so on and so forth.
I have a friend who is dealing a lot with hospital data. And one of his tasks is actually to check whether the data was not forged somehow. Because, you ask doctors to collect data, or any other medical practitioners, doesn't have to be doctors. And sometimes, they forget or something happens and they might just write random numbers. So his task is actually to say, wait, this data looks suspicious, or this is probably not real data. This is also fascinating to me. How do you actually see that this is human filling in the blanks rather than actually being able to collect the correct data,
Yes, there are multiple techniques, not only to check whether this data is somehow forged or if it's an outlier out of the distribution, but also sometimes you have missing data for many reasons. But sometimes there are also techniques to impute this data that is missing and somehow fill the gaps. It's very important what you said about hospitals, because doctors and nurses and so on don't have incentives. It's not their job to create good data sets, right? And it's very important because sometimes a doctor is working with a particular patient and then the next patient and the next and the next. And they might work slightly different for each patient depending on the thing. So maybe the data set that this doctor will create is not fully uniform and good looking. It doesn't have a protocol that will somehow provide a data set with good quality. If we want medical research, we need to create the figure of someone that is in the hospital creating good data. So we need to have some data service that will be in charge of creating good data in the hospitals.
One more thing, we talked about the medical data that was used, the imaging that was, taken from the web or just actually collected, let's say crowdsourced, we could say. How often actually it happens? Because for me, this is surprising. My assumption is, you have people preparing these models, training. It's all vetted, validated, looked at by specialists. Radiologists come into play and say, this is it, this is that. There's always that human in the loop, always that analysis. It's quality data, right?
Well, I'm very pessimistic. That's my opinion. But I'm pessimistic for a reason, because there are thousands of articles online in very diverse journals. And then there are the very good journals like Nature, Science, The Lancet, and so on. And it's a matter of resources. Some universities have very good resources. They can hire tens of people. They also already have the infrastructure from previous financing. So when other universities want to do that, it becomes a challenge because you start from scratch. And then there is this pressure to publish by many universities and the field in general that is published or perish. And that forces also researchers and students to come up with publications one way or another. So it's very common that they end up using data that was collected at different places. They download it from the internet, from public repositories, but then they end up mixing data sets. For instance, you may have a data set from China, from a pediatric hospital that shows healthy patients, and then you take another data set from the United States that shows diseased people, and you mix them to create a data set of healthy and diseased people, and you work with it. But again, we already mentioned that this can come with issues because this data was generated in a different way. If we are working with chest X-ray images, for instance, the size of the heart might be different because on one side we have children and on the other side we have everything. So there might be differences in this new data set that we have created that create problems. And then there's something worse. These researchers will release this new data set with their own name or whatever and say, we have published a new data set that basically stems from other two. So it's like a snowball that is getting bigger because of this pressure to publish.
And it's also a good point for all the listeners who maybe don't, like me, read a lot of scientific journals and articles. Always look at the data set, right? So always look at where the data came from, what was the analysis. Of course, simple things like the sample, but not only how many people participated, but also how it was collected and how it was analyzed. And it goes back to, very simple thing. We all do it right now. We all talk about it and it's always existent. I'm joking a little bit here. I mean, reproducibility, right? Of course.
Exactly. Reproducibility is key for good research. But also I will say that policies to make good data easily available are important because sometimes the worst data sets are the most popular ones. And there are researchers here at CHL and the university who work on this, and they proved that the bad data set was most popular than the good one. But sometimes the good data set requires a lot of bureaucracy to get. And it might take you 1 year since you requested to retrieve this data that is actually good quality. So we need to work on that as well if we want to make good reproducible science as well.
Why is it like that? Because it's just more readily available?
No, because ethics, basically. If you are publishing or making available data from people to other researchers, the owner of this data needs to make sure that whoever is requesting this data will use it for good purposes and in an ethical way, right? So that's why sometimes the bureaucracy takes so much, because the owner of the data needs to make sure of this, that it will be well used. And then if you are a researcher who can wait 1 year, you fall back to the data that is readily available without these restrictions, right?
Great, you said ethics. How did you know that we're going back to the pub quiz question right now? That's so good. Brilliant. The guest is, doing the job for me. I can sit back and relax. So listeners, remember, in almost the beginning of the podcast, not exactly, a couple of minutes in, we had a pub quiz question for you. So right now, Carlos, can you remind our listeners what the question is about? And then listeners, of course, you will get to know the answer.
The question was, how do the protests of women fighting for their right to wear trousers or the miniskirt in the 60s relate to the cookie banner that we can see in every website nowadays? And the answer is about control. The idea is that these women were fighting for their right to wear whatever they wanted, trousers, the miniskirt, but the intention was not to replace a code of conduct by another code of conduct, not to replace a code of dressing by another code of dressing. It was just to have the right to wear whatever you want. And in the case of data, it's the same. We as data subjects should have the right to control our data, to withdraw it when it's collected, to opt in or opt out for analytics in a website, and so on and so forth. So for me, the key word in data ethics is control. Whenever we gain a new right, it's because it gives us control to do something or not.
And how are we right now? Let's just look at Europe. What's the situation of our control over our data?
Well, right now, even in the kindergarten, you need to sign an agreement on how the data of your children will be used and how long it will be stored and so on and so forth. So I think it's everywhere and it's a good sign, but there are still other things that need to work. For instance, what we mentioned about copyright of the artist. If we want to have small artists publishing their work, or photographers, people who don't have the means to get into legal battles, they also need to have this kind of protection, because then you have the big fish who will scrap all this information from the internet and use it for their purposes. And one example of this is fashion again, because you have small artists or small creators that come up with new clothes, new patterns, and they publish, of course, their work in the internet so that you can buy it. But then you can have the big companies that will scrap this information to get new patterns, and then they will produce massively new clothes with these new patterns and somehow supersede the small
creators.
Yes.
But that's possible? I mean, in my naive world, I thought, I don't know, you are protected, copyright, I don't know, you can try to sue or not. You're too small for that.
Exactly. And again, this only applies sometimes to Europe. If you have a company in a different country outside the EU, they could scrap a store that is hosted in the EU. They could use this information, I don't know, in China, in Vietnam, in the United States, whatever, to produce new clothes, because nothing stops someone from other countries to reach a website that is hosted in Europe, right? So this way, our protection is limited only to our country. And then even if it will be a European company, if you sue this company, you can get into a battle of years. Whenever it's solved, it's already too late for you.
What fascinates me as well is that, sometimes I look for toys for my children on the internet. And in the past, of course, you had an original idea. You had the one and only producer of that original idea. And then, of course, you would have some small people trying to imitate. But nowadays, I have a feeling that you Google something, you look on one of the websites, and you actually have 15 producers of the same thing. So this is exactly that kind of possibility that, you find it on the web and you start producing something similar, I guess, even in toy land, if you want.
Yes, is also the case, but sometimes it's basically can be the same manufacturer selling with a different name at a different price range. So you might go to some online store, find a product at 20 euros, and then you find the same product for 10 euros, but it's been manufactured by the same place, but sold in a different way, because some people will prefer to buy the one that is cheaper, others will feel more safe with that. And their data science is also very important, because these companies might do some A/B testing on the price and see which price works best. And they are collecting a lot of information on these purchases, and they can use that to maximize the benefits, of course.
That's going far away from the science discussion we are having here, but of course ethics is also important. Anything else? What about being anonymous? Can we really be anonymous?
Well, that is a very good question, and there are examples that show that is very challenging. I remember there was a Netflix challenge that developers should create a recommending system for the movies, and then for this, Netflix released a dataset that supposedly was anonymous. It was just an ID of the user, like a number, and then the ratings of the movies, which movies someone saw and whether they like it with 4 stars, 5 stars, and so on. And with that information, the developers need to create a recommending system. But then some researchers took the same dataset and correlated the dataset with the Internet Movie Database, which is a public place where you can openly share your opinion on some movies. But the difference is that in Netflix, you don't expect someone to know the movies you rated. In the Internet Movie Database, you expect everyone to know. So maybe you saw some movie that you don't want someone to know that you watch, and it's only in the Netflix dataset. So these researchers were able to map, by looking at the patterns, the users from the Internet Movie Database to the users' anonymized dataset of the Netflix dataset. And they found some relevant information. There was a woman in the United States who sued Netflix because these researchers managed to publish this remap of the users through the dataset of Internet Movie Database. And basically they throw her out of the closet because she was a wife, secretly lesbian, who watched some movies that could hint on her sexual orientation without her consent. She didn't review these movies in Internet Movie Database, and you never know if someone wants to make this decision public or not. And basically, they did without her consent, and she won and managed to get a good money from Netflix. And after this, Netflix stopped doing this challenge.
I'm always laughing with my friend because once in a while we're trying to, use all the incognito modes and change VPNs and whatever. But in the end, resistance is futile. I think this is very, very difficult. And we're talking about a situation where we have to function in this world as well. We have to function in the data world. And certain services are provided to us only if we function in there. And of course, the ideal situation would be we can opt out. But can we really?
Well, it depends. Even if you opt out, when you use the incognito mode, it will be possible to analyze the patterns and somehow find that this pattern corresponds to another pattern in a different place and so on, find you. Of course, is someone up to the task of finding you? Are you interesting enough?
Probably not. Of course, we all want to think that we are, but, let's face it, right? And with this very, very positive note, I don't know, we hope, at least I hope that we didn't depress our listeners about the fact that it's a bit difficult to function in the world of data. But at the same time, just remember, things are changing. We're talking about data ethics. We're talking about philosophy of science and everything else. And data science as such is also a really fast developing field. So watch out the space and and check what Carlos is doing as well, because I'm sure there's going to be more published and done and resolved. Thank you so much, Carlos, for coming today and sharing all this with us.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, to check our brand new website. I'm very excited because it's really like a couple of days that it's there for you to discover. And of course, the website comes also with something that is very dear to my heart. We are developing, we're expanding. We'll be also interviewing European researchers. So if you want to support us, if you want to show willingness to let us grow, then, there is a small support button there as well. So if someone feels like clicking, we don't mind you doing that. And yes, and remember that we will still continue talking to researchers based in Luxembourg. This was SciLux, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.